Taco Bell late one night, and now you're in the ride sharing. Investors start to look at Uber as an advertising business, having an advertising business kind of like they do Amazon now.
I have used it in the 2 times that I've gone to Brazil, and it's been very, very, very helpful. Driving, especially in a place like Sao Paulo, is it's like taking your life in your hands. So
from a numbers perspective, the company looks really good.
All right, folks, welcome to Investing for Beginners podcast. Today, we're going to do a bird's eye view. We're going to take a look at Uber Technologies, or Uber. And this is a company, frankly, I don't know that much about. And Andrew recently looked into a little bit. We had a challenge in our Value Spotlight community to take a look at companies that were outside of our circle of competence and see if we could build a little bit. And this is one of the companies that Andrew looked into. So I thought it would be kind of fun for us to talk about Uber. And since I just got back from Brazil and used it a whole bunch down there, I thought it was kind of appropriate, at least fresh on my mind, is to find out what's what with Uber. So maybe let's start with, what do they do? What are they?
Yeah, pretty simple. Download the app, get hooked up with a random driver who also has the app. He drives you around and you pay and go on your way. How was the Uber experience over there in Brazil?
It was as seamless as it is here. It was kind of interesting in two of the bigger cities that we were in, Sao Paulo and Curitiba. They actually, for safety reasons, they instituted a PIN. So when you would call up a ride and they would send you somebody, they would send you a PIN. And so to make sure you could verify each other, they would ask me for the PIN, and then I would have to watch them enter it in. And then that was like, okay, we're verified that this is a right driver. So it felt very safe, just like it would here in the United States. So that was kind of cool.
As you were taking the Ubers, did you think like, oh, this might be interesting to look at as an investment?
Yeah, for sure, because it seemed like a few of the people that were driving us, we talked to mostly through my wife, because my Portuguese is not the best. We talked a little bit about like their experience with it and whatnot, and they were very bullish on the company, and they really liked working for Uber. That was two of the two people we talked to. That's what they did for a living, and they said they made a pretty good living doing it. It was interesting. After experiencing it, I frankly have not used it much here in the United States, but I have used it in the 2 times that I've gone to Brazil, and it's been very, very, very helpful, because renting a car there can be expensive, and driving, especially in a place like Sao Paulo, it's like taking your life in your hands. So I found it interesting, and it certainly intrigued me enough to think about, would this be something that I would buy or not?
You mentioned the Circle of Competence Challenge. So if listeners out there aren't subscribed, they might not know. I haven't yet to this point recommended a stock that actively dilutes shares, at least does so on a very regular basis, and is in that kind of early growth stage of their life cycle. Uber, very much so. They're at this inflection point where they're reaching profitability, and they're basically, from a financial perspective, they are crossing the line from unprofitability to profitability and burning cash flow to generating cash flow. At the same time, they're still raising capital when I looked at them. So they're still in that growth mode where they're raising capital. It's an interesting time in their life cycle for sure, which was what drew me to them as the challenge, because I was like, all right, I'm going to try to look at diluters, jump outside my circle of competence and try to look at those. And so strictly from a numbers perspective, company looks really good. Revenues, like we said, the margins are expanding. So now all of a sudden they have all these profits. Balance sheet super, super strong. Return on capital, I looked them up on New Constructs of a membership with them, and they calculate ROIC with adjustments. So it's not a distorted, suppressed, or overstated ROIC. It's just crossed the whack, which means they're creating value now instead of destroying value with their growth. So a lot of good numbers. And from a numbers perspective, I don't know how else to say it. It just looks really good.
Yeah, it really does. It's interesting too because I mentioned that to you when we were looking at the numbers before we jumped on here. Like it looks, it looks good.
Yeah.
It looks really good. And you know, I some of my view is jaded a little bit. There was a series on Netflix called Super Pumped that they talked about the early days of the company with when Travis Kalanick was running the business. He's no longer with the company anymore. He was the one that kind of got it off its feet and kept it running when it was going through hard times. And it's a very interesting documentary. It's not really a documentary. It's kind of I don't know, a biopic or something, but there were some negative things that were taking place during that. And so I had that kind of a little bit jaded look at it, the company. But then I heard an interview with the current CEO and I really liked him. I thought he was very sharp, very well spoken, clear headed. And I thought he had some good ideas for visions of how the company could continue to expand and grow. I wasn't super up on the company, and it's always been kind of on the periphery for me. I know that our friend Vitaly Katzenelson invested in them early on and has been a big supporter of Uber way before I even ever considered investing in it. So it's interesting to see the company kind of mature, like come from a child to now it's becoming an adult. And so that's interesting to observe. But I guess what are your thoughts on the whole diluting part of it? Like, how does that enter into your equation?
I guess that it never got far enough along where I ever felt like I was entering that into the equation for any of the companies I looked at that were
Mhm.
diluters. Kind of along that note, when you think of dilution, you think of capital allocation. What is the company doing? What is management doing with the money? One of the things, if this is a bird's eye view, and we're talking about trying to look at companies from a big picture, I like to use quickfs.net and look at cash flow statement. So it shows you like a 10-year period of all the different numbers. And so just scanning through each column, I noticed that, oh, wow, $5 billion went to investments in the last 12 months. So looking at the cash flow statement, then you go on the 10K, the annual report. One of the things that I thought was interesting, they have these non-marketable equity securities and marketable equity securities. So they have 2.2 billion in DD, which is
Oh, the ride share in
Uber,
China, right?
the Uber in China. They
Yeah.
have 1.8 billion in a company called Grab, 1.4 billion in a company called Aurora. And it was like 2 years ago, something like that. They took like a $7 billion loss unrealized on their investments. In the last 12 months, they've made cash from operations around 6.2 billion, stock-based compensation 1.8. So that 7 billion was a pretty high, I guess, markdown in value. It'll
Mm.
be interesting to see, is that something that continues? Are they going to be very aggressive in buying equity securities and almost become like capital allocators in that way versus
Mhm.
expanding Uber's business? I don't know enough about the CEO or the company to really make a statement one way or the other, but that's something that jumps out to me that would say, okay, the numbers look great. Maybe I may or may not like the company, but what's the going to be the capital allocation story, particularly if stock-based compensation is so high and the dilution so high?
Mhm. Have you I frankly have never looked at a company that's made kind of this transition from cash burner to cash generator. And I'm curious why they would keep diluting when they're getting into the whole profitability thing. That's a question that pops into my head when not just looking at them, but other companies as they go through this cycle. Like when does one turn on and the other one turn off? Or do some companies just continue to do both?
Right. Oh, yeah. I mean, same here. As a complete outsider kind of opinion, I don't look at companies like this hardly at all.
Mhm.
Falls outside my circle of competence, but you would just wonder if the stock-based compensation is so high,
Mhm.
and if you haven't announced a buyback plan, you just naturally get that dilution from stock-based compensation. I don't know
Mhm.
how hard is it to reverse stock-based compensation. I guess million different ways you could do the stock-based compensation. 2019, they did 4.5 billion, almost 4.6 billion. And then 2020, it was like 800 million. So that's a pretty huge. 2019 had a huge one, and I would want to know why that's the case too. So, yeah, I mean, stock-based compensation is one of those things. Like, have we seen that fully play out in this market cycle? I'm not sure either.
Right. Yeah, for sure. What do you think are some of the potential risks that a company like Uber could be facing?
To answer a question like that, you got to go to the risk factors of the 10K and see what kind of things stick out. A few things I saw, autonomous vehicles could be coming for them. And I think paired with that, they mention in the risk factors about criminal activity
Mm,
inside their Ubers. And so if that becomes something that gets worse and worse, would people prefer to have a robot drive them who they know can't be violent versus somebody who might be?
mm,
They also mentioned some of the stuff in California that's happening around electrification. 90% of rideshare miles are going to have to come from zero emission vehicles.
oh
So how
boy.
does that impact Uber's business? I don't know. Some of those things, and I don't know if they mentioned this specifically, but it was something I wrote in my notes, like low switching costs.
Mm,
If you don't want to take an Uber anymore, how hard is it to download Lyft or take a taxi?
mm,
And that's some of the problem I have with some of the apps in general. But obviously, every app is different.
mm,
But to uninstall an app is pretty easy.
yeah.
So we are in a very unique time where platforms like Uber and Airbnb could, in theory, I mean, I know for Airbnb, they're generating crazy amounts of cash on like very little capital intensity.
Mm-hmm,
Uber seems to maybe be moving that direction, but they're also just apps on an app store. So,
mm-hmm,
what's the switching cost? We don't know the answer to that. And it makes for a very interesting potential a range of outcomes. If it's something you feel like you have an insight towards, maybe it's one of your big wealth generation drivers.
mm-hmm.
If you don't and you're a little more cautious, maybe you're just on the sidelines going to see how it all plays out. And I don't know, those are some of the things that stood out to me. Is there anything that stands out to you?
Kind of doubling down a little bit on what you said about the electrification slash robotic driver with the news related to Waymo and some of the things that they've been doing recently. There's been speculation, if you will, that there could be some consolidation that goes on, or that there, for example, I think I read somebody saying that if Tesla continues to struggle with their self-driving, maybe they start to work with Uber to develop the electric fleet that Uber needs to meet the requirements of California, for example. I know there's been some chatter about something like that, or there's been chatter that maybe Tesla would buy Waymo and they would use the electric cars, robotic cars, and maybe they would lease them to Uber. I think there's a lot of I think there's a lot of uncertainty on which way that's going to go. And then I don't know if Uber is working specifically on autonomous driving themselves. I have no idea. But if they are, then that could undermine the people that are working with them now. And if that becomes public, then that could be very harmful to the company too, because if you know the company's coming for your job, how loyal would you be to drive for Uber if you know that they're trying to basically take away your livelihood? I'm not saying that's happening, but there's been some speculation that some of these things could play out and could be an impact on Uber. And then I think there's also been some noise about how they could perform globally. The United States is right now the biggest part of their revenues, and there's some concern, I think, that maybe regulation could bite them in the butt in other countries. There's certainly some uncertainty with what's going on, and I think your point about the whole app thing is very apropos. I mean, to your point, there's no switching costs. When I lived in Chicago, where we lived, more people used Lyft than they did Uber, and mostly because it was cheaper. And my daughter lives in Milwaukee, and I know she and her friends prefer Lyft because it's cheaper. I think there is certainly some uncertainty with the company and some of the goings on. So those are things that I know, I guess from an outsider's view, that I have heard more recently.
Yeah, and I think for me, hearing from some of the people in our community, because we talked about this as one of our live streams just
Mm,
for fun and diving into the DCFs of, I can't remember who the other company was, but we definitely looked at Uber.
mm,
And some of the numbers on there are pretty compelling. 19 million members across Uber One, Eats Pass, and Rides Pass. The fact that when they get an Uber Eats customer, that they tend to convert into a high revenue ride sharing customer. So you
oh,
start on you start ordering some Taco Bell late one night, and now you're in the ride sharing. Also, the new ads segment, they have 550,000 active ad merchants now. How does that do investors start to look at Uber as an advertising business,
mm,
having an advertising business kind of like they do Amazon now? Could also be something on the upside. So those type of things, again, with the numbers, with the fact that the PE was what, like very, very cheap. QuickFS is saying a 32 PE, and I don't
mm.
know what their forward PE is. It's probably under 25, I would guess. Yeah, forward PE of 28 on revenues. What does FinChat say?
Uh,
3 year
41%. Yeah, 41% over the last 3 years.
CAGR,
Yeah,
not
CAGR.
41% total,
Yeah,
41% CAGR,
41% CAGR over the last 3 years.
26% CAGR past 5 years.
Yeah,
All of those things just point to bull, 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 right?
right. Yeah.
But you go back to the moat and the capital allocation and those two things. How do you feel about switching costs? How do you feel about uncertainty of the business, and how willing are you to have the appetite to take those risks? And so for me, when we talked about it with the community, there was a lot of different insights, and to hear the different perspectives. Some people were up on Uber, some people were like, no, it sucks. Some people were like, I can switch between Uber or Lyft.
Mm,
And that again, that was a very cool thing to see in a group of people with diverse viewpoints that you might not get just kind of in your head in the 10K.
mhm,
So I found that interesting, and it helped for me personally, I guess, to reduce FOMO if Uber does become a huge thing, and I'm choosing not to buy now. At least the thought process has happened of like, what risks are you willing to
mm.
take? And at the end of the day, especially the further down the growth cycle you are, that's what it boils down to, right?
Mhm,
What kind of risks are you willing to take, and how is that turning into action to you as an investor?
mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, to your point, the revenue growth, which is really nice right now, at some point it will slow down. And then it becomes what kind of profitability can they generate? What kind of returns can they generate on the profits that they have? And it becomes a different kind of story. To kind of go back to the whole app thing, like if you think about Netflix compared to Uber, the switching costs, I feel like are, and I could be wrong, but I feel like the switching costs for Netflix are stronger than they would be for Uber because nobody and their brother wants to cancel Netflix, but Uber you could take it or leave it. Like I think there's some people that really love it, but I also think there's a lot of people that are very ambivalent or don't like it at all because they've had bad experiences, or maybe they're in an area where they just don't have adequate service. And I don't feel like the same rules apply to Netflix. And so that's why I feel like they're both app-based businesses, but one feels certainly a lot stronger of a moat than the other.
I wonder about the whole autonomous driving thing, and
Mm,
what that does. I don't know. I don't follow autonomous driving too closely.
mm.
Did see a kind of funny video on Instagram of a guy got stuck in a airport parking lot, and the Waymo was just going in circles. and just continue going in circles. That was pretty funny. He was being kind of stubborn with the customer service person, but made for a funny uh, comedic bit.
Right.
But does that technology continue to improve, and what does that do for Uber? And then to your point, can Uber actually benefit from that?
Mm.
When we look at stories like Tesla, in hindsight, we all like to pretend like we all knew that Tesla was going to, like, it should have been so obvious. Teslas started popping
Oh,
up everywhere. We should have just
sure.
owned the stock. They were 24 hours away from going bankrupt. So, not saying that that's the case for Uber, but I'm just saying there are risks to investing in these types of businesses. But the flip side is also the payout can be really huge depending on
Mhm.
what business you're talking about. It's really just, I think, a really different way of investing. But what's fun about it is you can learn it more information, and
Mhm.
if facts change, you can change your mind. Or if your circle of competence on the company changes, if you see something that the market doesn't see, then something that has always scared you off can turn into an opportunity.
Mhm.
It's not exciting. It's kind of boring. But what we offer is a free ebook and email series at stockmarketpdf.com.
Yeah, absolutely it could. And I think to me, that's the exciting thing about investing
Mm.
is the more you study businesses and learn about the different companies, because there's so many of them, they're so diverse, and there's so many great opportunities and maybe things you want to stay away from. But the more that you learn about them, you can apply that knowledge to this business and this business and this business. And even to your point about the FOMO earlier, we don't have to swing at every pitch. And I think that's one thing we always have to remember is you can find companies that have attractive qualities to them, but maybe there's parts of it that don't fit your personality investing style. And that's okay. You don't have to swing at this pitch. You can swing at another pitch and you can go in a different direction. And it doesn't mean like the more like you did some work on Uber, right? And you decided that this doesn't fit your type of company right now. But the work that you do now compounds such that let's say 2 or 3 years from now, maybe you come back to it and you learn, okay, so you kind of learn on top of what you already learned and you have other experiences in analyzing other companies that you can bring to what you're looking at now. And so you may look at it like the facts have changed and so you change your mind. And that happens all the time. And I think that's to me, that's the exciting kind of fun part about investing and looking at these companies. That to me is the thing that I find the most exciting is trying to learn about all these new businesses. And it's just endlessly fascinating to me.
Do you think that's why the mature industries aren't that fascinating to study? Because the facts really don't change that much?
It could be. I mean, that could be part of it too. But then certainly a company that's more mature or air quote longer in the tooth than somebody like Uber may not be as exciting because yeah, like you said, the facts don't change much. It just kind of keeps doing what it does. A company like American Water that's been paying a dividend for what 100 some years or whatever crazy number it is, that probably doesn't change a whole lot. I've never looked into it, so I'm just guessing here, but I think that's probably why. But the flip side of that is that, at least for me, and I think somewhat to you too, my psychology is more along the lines of heads I win, tails I don't lose that much. And so my mentality fits into maybe the older boring companies more so than it does to something like an Uber. I'm not saying that I can't slide down the scale some, but it's harder for me to move in a direction like towards a company like an Uber than it would be to something that's a little more, I guess, boring.
Could you argue, though, that that work should be done anyway? Let's say you were invested in newspapers and all you did was analyze Buffalo News versus Washington Post or whatever, and just completely ignored looking at Google.
Yeah.
Is that a good way to, that even if you're investing in a mature industry, you should
Mm.
still be on top of the places where the facts do change.
I think you should. As a well-rounded investor or somebody that is interested in investing, I think you need to keep your eyes open, and I think you need to have an open mind to be able to look at something. To use your example, if you're looking at Buffalo News, Washington Post, and New York Times, you still should look at Google and understand what it is they do. And even though it may not be something that you invest in potentially, it could be because maybe the trends are drifting that way. And you can make a great return even if you don't get in early. If you don't buy Google at an IPO, but you buy it 10 years later, you can still have a fabulous return. So it doesn't mean that you have to change your investing style or what you're comfortable with just to partake in things. But I think as the more you learn about something like Uber, the more it can apply to something like an Amazon, a Google, a Netflix, any of those kinds of businesses, because there's parts of what they're doing that also fit into Airbnb.
Yeah.
And they're different businesses, but they're related in what they do. And the more you learn about Uber, the more you can learn about Airbnb. You could start to understand both of them and maybe go, okay, Airbnb to me right now, the way I invest, it fits better than maybe Uber does. But doesn't mean that someday Uber wouldn't slide into that slot, if you will. And I think that's how you grow and learn as an investor. And I think if we look at any of the people that we like and admire and have taught us a lot, I think that's what they've done is they've evolved as they've experienced more.
Yeah. And I mean, I think of like Nick Sleep and blanking on the second guy's name.
Zacharias or
Zachariah. Yeah, I don't want
yeah.
to butcher it.
No, I don't either. That's as
Nick
far
and
as
Zach.
I'm willing to go.
Okay. Yeah. They looked at everything. They spent like a very intense period of time looking at literally everything for I think it was like 7 or 8 years.
Yep.
And then decided on, okay, I think we found something where the facts don't change much, and loaded up, and that's done really well for them.
Mm-hmm.
You could argue maybe Buffett's done something similar with things like Coca-Cola or Apple because he has such a long time horizon.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to think that he's thinking like, what are the risks that I can't even think of right now?
Mm-hmm.
And how will the company fight against those?
Right.
That's got to come with experience, though. I mean,
Oh yes.
that's like taking it to the whole next level, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you Buffett's an easy example of that because if you look at his younger years, I wouldn't say he was buying growth companies, but he was buying way different types of businesses and holding them for much shorter periods of time than as he got older. When he was in his 30s, he was investing completely different than the way he was when he was in his 50s. And now in his 70s and now 90s, he's maybe solidified a little bit more, but he still is investing way differently than he was when he was 34, for example. I think that's a perfect example of how the more you learn, the more experience you get, the more burned you get by bad choices, the more you learn and the more you'll grow, become a better investor. I think that's the way you do it.
What is your word of advice for somebody who maybe feels overwhelmed about learning about businesses or discouraged, maybe ran into a roadblock and they're trying to analyze businesses? What would be a word or two of encouragement for them?
Number one, I think the thing that I've always tried to remember is water dripping on a stone eventually makes an impression. And so even though you don't understand, I use this example so everybody that's listened to this for a while is sick of me hearing saying this, but I'm going to say it one more time. Visa, I didn't understand it. I kept trying and trying and trying, and then finally one day I got it. And if I can do it, anybody can do it. So it's just a matter of spending the time and trying. And it's okay to not understand something and move on and come back to it another time, because the experience you get learning about Google and Microsoft could help you learn way more about Amazon down the road if that's what you're really trying to understand. And I think the more that you experience, the more that you learn, and the more that you learn, the easier it'll get to learn about other things And I think the I guess the two most important parts are follow your curiosity, follow things that you find interesting. Doesn't mean that they necessarily will be investments for you, but just follow your curiosity, because that will encourage you to keep going. And number two is persistence. Just keep trying. Just keep picking up the 10Ks and reading them as much as you can. And the more that you do that, the easier it'll get. I promise you.
That's awesome. That's going to do it for us today. I hope you found something useful. I hope you found encouragement, and I hope you found inspiration. Maybe not all those three, maybe at least one. We would be happy with that.
Yes.
You can reach out to us at newsletter@einvestingforbeginners.com. Send us your questions. We love to answer them on the show. Connect, learn, and grow with Value Spotlight. Peace.